Watercolor secrets aren't so much secrets as they are watercolor rewords. It's likely that you've heard of or experienced these watercolor moments I'm about to show you, but I'm about to teach these watercolor tricks and tips in a way that will foster some serious aha moments. And when you first start as a watercolor beginner, you think that you should be able to learn from all the teachers all the ways, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So let's get into today's lesson and stick around for number 4 because it's a doozy. Number 1. Water control is important, but your paper towel is too. Most often, you'll find me in this stance while painting. I've got a paper towel in my left hand because my right is my dominant. And I've got another paper towel tucked underneath my watercolor palette nearby my right hand. Here's the thing. As much as we need to know how much water to load onto our brush, keep on our brush, reload onto our brush, and the ratio of all that to paint, we also really need to know when it's time to remove excess water or paint. And a rolled up paper towel around your finger on your non-dominant hand is an amazing reminder and quick way to get rid of a little extra moisture or paint when you need to. Let me show you what I mean. Just painting a really simple flower here. The idea is to get some water on the page in the shape of something that kind of resembles a petal. Trust me, this is not about painting an actual flower. It's just about understanding how to use this paper towel. I immediately realized when adding that green that too much of it was exploding into the pinks and the yellows. So just boom, a little tap on my paper towel in my left hand, and I fixed that issue. Now here on the left-hand side, I'm actually removing paint, and having this paper towel so nearby where I'm removing the paint from is just making the whole process feel more seamless, more effortless, versus having to go all the way across to my right-hand side and remove that paint on that paper towel. Now you'll remember I said I have a paper towel also on my right-hand side near my dominant hand. That paper towel is more for when I'm reaching for some water, and yes, I keep my water on my right side, on my dominant hand side. When I'm reaching for that water and I've got too much and I immediately know it, I'm going for that right-hand side paper towel. As you watch me paint this flower, just notice how much more I'm using the paper towel that is balled up around my finger and how much more efficient my painting experience becomes. Not that we're about efficiency in watercolor. We want to enjoy the moment, enjoy the process, but it makes everything feel more smooth. And I'm not constantly reaching over the opposite side of my paper to get what I need. It leaves more room in your brain for actually thinking about water control in a more traditional way. There's an entire video dedicated to traditional water control methods. I have it linked below for you. Number 2, watercoloring isn't coloring. I have to give a big grateful nod to Kristen Van Leuven, whose video here planted the seed. Now, I'm putting a twist on things, but goodness, her video gave me so many ideas. In Kristen's video, she paints 2 pots of greenery, and she talks about the fact that we need to not fill in a shape or a form with all the same value of a color. We need to think about a light source, which gives us light, dark, highlight, shadows. And so I am taking my step from there. And I'm going to say this, and I've said it before, it's so important. When you want to create a piece that's full of personality, has some je ne sais quoi in Watercolorland, if you know what I mean. So I'm also going to paint 2 pots. My first pot here on the left is all the same color. I've got a little bit of a change in lights and darks, but not much. Does it look bad? Absolutely not, especially when you haven't seen pot number 2. Adding some simple suggestions of greenery with a press and lift action, but the same idea. I'm using the same green throughout. A little lifting here to give it more contrast, light and dark. Now it's time for pot number 2. And I'm approaching this one with the idea, or the rule, dare I say, every time I go back to the palette, I'm going to pick up a different version of the first color I started with. So for example, I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the same rust that I started with. And I'm going to repeat that rule every time I go to refill my brush. A slightly different color, but in the same family. So for the pot, it's going to be all warm, kind of sunny, reddish, rusty tones, but I'm never going to try to mix or grab the same exact color twice. All the while, I'm still thinking about lights and darks, highlights and shadows, and where my light source is coming from. For example, in this painting, my light source is coming from the right. So anything that's on the right, closest to the light, is going to be very much the lightest value in the pot or the painting. Same thing goes for the greenery, which actually I think is more like a cactus going on in my brain right now. Every time I go back to the palette, I'm going to grab a yellow green, a blue green, maybe a little green that has a purple mixed into it, maybe a little green that has, you get the drill. So paying attention to a light source, like Kristen says, paying attention to values, lights and darks, making sure you've got nice contrast between your highs and lows or your lights and darks. In addition to varying the colors that you use are going to give you a really spirited piece that is extremely convincing of the subject matter you're trying to paint. All right, let me know what you think. Do you feel like this going back to the palette, always picking a different color, will work for you, or is it just too chaotic? Head into comments and let me know. Number 3 is what I call how much and when. Listen up. Gonna get a little heavy here. How much paint is on your brush and where that paint is concentrated on the actual brush is key to maintaining control in your painting. So we're talking water control, but we're also talking about that feeling of emotional control. Like you know what's going on and you feel like you're moving and grooving in the right direction as you paint. Let me show you what I mean. I'd really suggest just watching this one. It's definitely not a paint along situation, at least your first time around. I'm going to use one color to keep things simple. My brush is damp, just enough to pick up some color, and I'm going to get that color on the page, but my brush, I'm just using the tip on that first stroke. Then I'm going about halfway, loading it with color, and then I'm loading the whole entire width of the tip of the brush. And look there, those first 3 strokes, how the color is different. It appears so different. I'm getting a little more water on my brush now. That went fast. Let's look again and slow things down. The first stroke I'm making here, I'm loading the color just on the tip of my brush and making a stroke. The second stroke I'm making, I'm loading the color at about halfway across the entire width of the brush. And then the third stroke, I am loading the full width of the brush. Now that we can see all 3 strokes and we've slowed things down a bit, it's important to note, yes, of course, the width of the stroke is going to look different across all 3 strokes, but the way that the color appears on the page also looks different because the amount of water that you needed on your brush to load the entire width of the brush for that third stroke differed from the amount of water you needed to make that first stroke loading just the tip of that brush with color. So it's not only about that paint to water ratio on your brush, it's about how much of your brush has paint and water on it at the time it hits your paper. That first row of brush strokes I did using a damp brush. Now let's see the same experiment with a dry brush. What's interesting to note here, the same idea, tip, half of the brush, the full width used. 3 brush strokes, but with a dry brush. And look at the interesting textures you can get. And look at the different ways the paint attaches to the paper. Because again, let's face it, that third stroke, even though this was with a dry brush, you had to have a little bit more water on the brush to even get the paint to show up. So I want you to think about these nuances as you're painting next time. And definitely rewatch this one and also definitely paint along with me. Try this experiment on your own at some point in the very near future. Promise yourself. Because actually making those simple strokes the way that I did following my diagram will blow your mind. You'll have so many aha moments that you couldn't have just watching it. All right, another experiment. I'm also making 3 strokes this time, the first of which will be a puddle of color in the shape of a rectangle. The second will be a damp rectangle, and the third will be a dry brush rectangle. Now I'm grabbing a second color on a clean brush. And I'm going to dab the same amount of paint on the brush into each of these rectangles, rinsing my brush in between. I'm being very careful to make sure I'm trying to load the same exact kind of wetness of paint, if you will. So each time I dab into these rectangles, same amount of paint, same amount of water on my brush. I want you to notice the difference, what things look like when I paint a stroke of color from a moderately damp brush filled with color onto a puddle, onto a damp area, and onto a dry area. And you're going to notice that same amount of paint in the puddle doesn't go very far. It kind of gets swallowed up. And as we go on to the dry rectangle, the same amount of paint overwhelms the first color. Moving on, I'm going to create the next row of rectangles. Same thing, puddle, damp, dry, but I'm going to load that color, that second pink color, onto half or a third of the brush's width. And you guessed it, eventually I'm going to create another third row and use the entire width of the brush. But remember, the amount of paint that I am dabbing into these rectangles, I'm trying my hardest to make it the same. This might feel really overwhelming right now, but it's just another way to think about water control. Some of the ways that water control is taught out there are not going to make sense for everyone. Now let me know. Did you have an aha moment? I want to hear about it. Or do I have some questions to answer? Let me know in comments. Stick around. Number 4, like I promised, is a doozy. You don't want to miss it because this might be your biggest aha moment yet. Number 4, don't fear running out. Quite possibly the simplest of the 4 today, but maybe the most important. Texture and a sense of unfinishedness is so important when building up character and personality in your art. And one of the quickest ways that you can get all of that character is to let your brush run out of paint. Yeah, I know you're like scratching your head, but let me show you. The best way to really see this and understand how it works is to really load up that brush, lots of color, lots of water, but a little bit more color than water, and make this wavy, loopy shape. And just repeat it again and again down the surface of your paper until you feel like it's ridiculous because you're running out of paint so badly. Look at all of the amazingness that's going on here, from where you started to where you ran out of paint. It's just mwah, chef's kiss. Love it. Now let's put it into practice. Painting one of my favorites, a leaf. I'm going to keep the shape of the leaves pretty simple. I'm using 1/2-inch dagger. And when I load my brush, I'm going to make it pretty juicy, but the goal here is to keep painting something that's recognizable as a leaf shape until I'm truly running out of paint and I can't make another recognizable leaf. And I'm just going to repeat that again and again and overlap these leaves. And you could create your own composition. The idea here is really not to make just this perfect, beautiful leaf composition, but to experience what it feels like to run out of paint, but use that run out to your benefit. Here I'm loading a juicy kind of medium green. I've got a lot of rich paint on the brush and I'm making shorter leaves because I'm curious what could happen when I continue to make these short leaves. How far can I go? You could also experiment with the idea, which I'm not showing here necessarily on the page right now, but grabbing a bigger brush and seeing how sopping wet, full of color you can get it to the point that it's not going to drip all over your page, and start painting until it runs out. And what is that going to look like? You can already see here the result is very ethereal. You've got a lot of natural contrast going on. This is also teaching you a ton about water control, but really it's best for you to paint along. As soon as you can after watching this video, or heck, go grab your paints right now and try this particular exercise, if you will, because just feeling it happen under your hands, there's nothing like it. Watching it happen, you'll get something out of it, but feeling it happen, paint along with me. And oh my word, I can't wait to hear all of the fun you uncover in your brain, and you got to tell me about it, okay? You got to tell me about it. Learning a new habit, getting your brain comfortable with actually allowing the brush to run out of paint, is going to feel uncomfortable at first. It will, but not for long, because you're going to see that you're building up contrast easily, effortlessly, without having to think too much. You're also going to see a ton of that personality just kind of happening by the fact that you're letting that brush run out to almost nothing. And of course, we can't ignore texture. Yes, watercolor is ethereal, and it's all about those flows of color from light to dark and the explosions and the wateriness and all that. But it's also about the texture. We can't forget about the gorgeous textures we can get in the messy middle of all those washes and explosions of color and cauliflowering. You know what I'm talking about. Now I want you to go try this. Just watching it unfold is entertaining, and you can learn a lot. But actually feeling this unfold by your own hand is so important. Go get you some happy painting.